Let us turn in our Bibles to the Gospel of Luke and chapter 18. Luke's Gospel and chapter 18. On the 9th of January this year, the funeral of former US President Jimmy Carter's National Cathedral. And as is the custom on such occasions, both present and all former US presidents were invited and expected to attend the occasion out of respect. On this occasion, that amounted to 5 US presidents, all seated on the same row. And who should be sitting together but Barack Obama and Donald Trump? Those in charge of the cameras that day could not resist the temptation to zoom in and to watch how the two men engaged with one another prior to the service starting. And why focus the camera on those two men when there was a cathedral full of people? There was even representatives of the royal family there. Why zoom in on those two men? It's because those two men are very different. They are poles apart in their politics. They have very different personalities. They have very different outlooks on how their country and this world should be governed. It's two men who have been very different in their own style of government. Two very different men, poles apart. And yet they were there, in the same place, at the same time, caught on camera, smiling and chatting away to one another. And wouldn't you have loved to have been sitting close by on that occasion so that you could have been a fly on the wall, as we say in English, and overhear their conversation? What on earth were they talking about? Does being a fly on the wall at a meeting of such vastly different people, does that appeal to you? If so, then let me take you this morning to a meeting between two men who were even more different and much further apart from one another than Barack Obama and Donald Trump were. Two men who were poles apart in every respect. And let's listen in to what they have to say. That's the occasion that's recorded for us in Luke chapter 18. And the first thing that we see is that here were two men who were very different in the estimation of others. Two men who were very different in the estimation of others. This section of Luke's Gospel begins away back in chapter 9, verse 51, where we read of Jesus resolutely setting out for Jerusalem. And as you follow Jesus on this long journey to Jerusalem, you discover that he meets all sorts of people. And that is why his audience is continually changing. For example, if you just want to turn the page back, a quick whiz through chapter 17 shows his audience changing 4 or 5 times within that chapter alone. It begins with him speaking to his disciples, verse 1. By verse 11, he's addressing 10 lepers. In verse 20, it is the Pharisees. Verse 22, it is the disciples again. At the start of chapter 18, it is still the disciples. But by the time you get to chapter 18, verse 9, it is those who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else. Did you hear that? Those who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else. Does that describe you this morning? Please note, I'm not asking if you consider yourself to be a Christian. I'm not asking if you tick the Christian box in the national census. I'm not asking how regularly you attend church. I'm asking you, does this describe you? Someone who's confident of your own righteousness and who looks down on everybody else. If that's you this morning, then please listen in. Please. Now, what you also discover in this section of Luke's Gospel is that in addressing those various groups of people, Jesus often told little stories or parables. He told one to his disciples in the opening paragraph of chapter 18, and now he tells another to this different audience in verses 9 to 14. And here is how this little story began. Verse 10. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. What we have to appreciate here is that these 2 men were at opposite ends of the spectrum as far as reputation and public opinion were concerned. The Pharisees were the religious leadership within first century Israel, within first century Jewish society, and consequently they played a prominent role in the moral and religious affairs of that nation. It was they who were responsible for ensuring that society toed the line on social and moral and religious matters. And so if Jerusalem TV was hosting a discussion, a panel on marriage, divorce, abortion, euthanasia, or any other ethical issue, it would be a Pharisee who was invited in to defend the morally conservative position. The Pharisees were responsible for encouraging people to fulfill their religious obligations. And so it's not surprising to read in verse 10 about this Pharisee going up to the temple to pray. That's not surprising, is it? The temple is precisely where you would expect to find this man, and praying is precisely what you would expect to find him doing, is it not? The Pharisees were considered by others to be the religious backbone, the moral fibre of their community. And so in view of the fact that first century Israel was a religious society, here was a man who was highly respected. Here was a man who was very good in the estimation of others. But then in sharp contrast to him, there was that other man who went to the temple to pray that day, and that is the tax collector. Now, when you and I hear of a tax collector going up to the temple, we may have in our minds, as a modern day equivalent, we may have in our minds a picture of an employee of the Inland Revenue attending church on a Sunday. We might think that's the modern day parallel. And consequently, the idea of a tax collector going up to the temple sounds perfectly reasonable to us. After all, why shouldn't employees of the Inland Revenue attend church? And just to say, if you do work for the Inland Revenue, you're very welcome this morning. But in coming to such a conclusion, we've failed to appreciate the significance of what is happening on this occasion. Because what we have here is not an honest employee of the Inland Revenue trying to do an honest day's work for the good of his country. That's not the sort of guy we've got. In fact, what we have here is the exact opposite. These tax collectors were employed by the occupying Roman authorities, and so they were treated with suspicion and considered to be traitors before they had even collected a penny's tax, before they even got started on their day's work. Can you picture it? Can you picture how someone from northern France would have been viewed during the Second World War if they were found to be collaborating with the occupying German forces? And not only collaborating, but using their collaboration to make a fortune at the expense of their fellow countrymen. Can you imagine how that Frenchman would have been regarded by others once they discovered what he was up to? And that's precisely what people thought of first century tax collectors. They were hated. They were despised. They were ostracized by the rest of society for being traitors to begin with. And in addition to being traitors, they were also crooks. Because it was normal practice for a tax collector to extract far more tax from the people than they were required to do. And where do you think that extra money went? It went straight into their pocket. Tax-free, of course. And so, not surprisingly, the tax collectors had a very comfortable lifestyle while most of the other people were on the breadline. These tax collectors were ruthless, immoral, corrupt, greedy characters, and everybody knew it. And consequently, people would have been shocked to see a first century tax collector go up to the temple. What on earth is he doing going there? If they had seen him entering the local pub or the local betting shop or the local brothel, they wouldn't have batted an eyelid. But the temple, that was the last place first century people expected to see their tax collector go. Such was the reputation of a tax collector. And so when we compare this Pharisee and this tax collector, I hope you've got the picture. What we have is two men who were very different in the estimation of others. Poles apart in every respect. The gulf between them could not have been greater. But not only are they two men who were very different in the estimation of others, as the story continues, we also see that these were two men who were very different in their estimation of themselves. Two men who were very different in their estimation of themselves. Now, in spite of the enormous contrast in the reputation of these two men, they found themselves in the same place at the same time, not with a camera on them, no cameras in those days, but they were nevertheless in the same place at the same time, and that place was the temple of all places. And having gone through the doors of the temple, what did the two of them proceed to do? Well, the Pharisee, we are told in verse 11, stood up and prayed this prayer: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, give a tenth of all I get. Here is a man who obviously had quite a high opinion of himself, hasn't he? And as he prays, we discover that he's come to that opinion by drawing a comparison between himself and other people. And what kind of people has he selected for the purpose of his comparison? Was it some of his fellow Pharisees? No, of course not. He never compared himself with those. Instead, it was the robbers of society, the evildoers, the adulterers, and the tax collectors. In other words, he's drawn a comparison between himself and the notoriously bad people of society, and by doing so, he's ended up being very good in the estimation of himself. But what about the tax collector? What did he do during his visit to the temple? Well, verse 13 says that he stood at a distance. Now, we're told today, the psychologists would tell us today, that body language reveals a lot about a person. And there's a lot of truth in that. And there certainly was a lot of truth in that on this occasion. This man is too ashamed to lift his head and look to heaven. Too ashamed. And so he stands there at a distance, looking down to the ground, and out of remorse for all the wrong things he's done, he beats his breast and says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. A sinner. That was this man's estimation of himself. Please note, he's not in the slightest bit concerned about the things which other people get up to. He's not bothered what other people get up to. Instead, he's concerned about his own actions and his own attitudes. As far as this man's concerned, that is more than enough to be concerned about without worrying about anybody else. And as he thinks about all of that, he cries out, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Or perhaps more literally translated, God, have mercy on me, the sinner. As he stands there thinking about his sin, it seems to him as if he's the only sinner in the entire world. That's how bad he feels about himself. Now, do you see the contrast between these two men? Not only in the estimation of others, but do you see the contrast between these two men in their estimation of themselves? The Pharisee struts into the temple with his head held high and proceeds to tell God how wonderful he is. Whereas the tax collector stands at a distance, hangs his head in shame, and acknowledges to God his utter sinfulness. Two men who were very different, not only in the estimation of others, but also in their estimation of themselves. And the question I want us to think about this morning is this: which of these two men are you like? Which of these two men are you like? Now, please note, I'm not asking which one we are like in terms of our reputation amongst other people. I'm asking which one we are like in terms of our estimation of ourselves. I'm not asking what others think about you. I'm asking what you think about yourself. What conclusions have you come to concerning yourself, your actions, your attitudes, and so on? Oh, you may be thinking to yourself, preacher, I've never really thought about myself to that extent. Really? Well, now is a good time to begin. And the reason I say that is because the verses which surround this little story make it clear that what we think about ourselves is very important and of huge significance. And so that being the case, where would you put yourself? I'm not asking where you'd put somebody else. Where would you put yourself on the big spectrum of Pharisee to tax collector? Where would you put yourself? I'm not asking where other people would put you on that spectrum. I'm not asking that. Because you know as well as I do that what other people see is often not a true picture of what we really are. You know that. What other people see is often the nice, pleasant, respectable and religious, especially on a Sunday morning as we come out the house, what they often see is the nice, pleasant, religious, respectable facade that we put on as we leave the house. You know that. We put it on just like we put our coat on. What they don't see are the things that we do within the secrecy of our own homes, and worse still, the attitudes that we have within the secrecy of our own hearts. They don't know about those things, but you and I do. We do. And I suspect that if we are to be honest this morning, we would all have to confess that there are things about us which are not very impressive. Aspects of our lives which, if others were to know, would leave us embarrassed and leave them much less impressed. But however uncomfortable that would be, it would be a more realistic estimation for them to have of us, and more importantly still, it would be a much more realistic estimation for us to have of ourselves. But can I emphasize that if we are going to come to that realistic opinion of ourselves, then it's vitally important that we compare ourselves against the correct standard. The reason the Pharisee never came to a realistic estimation of himself was because he compared himself against others whom it so happened were outwardly much worse than he was, and so made him look good. We can all do that and look reasonably good. And do so, and in doing so, deceive ourselves. You know the little story about the little boy who comes in from school? You maybe remember doing this when you were at school. There's been a test, and you've been given the results. And the little boy runs home from school and says, "Mummy, I got 43% in the exam, Tommy only got 33%, and James got 23. How bad is that, Mummy?" "What about Philip?" asked his mum. "Oh, he got 63%. And Edward? Oh, he got 73. And William? Oh, he got 83. Isn't it interesting that the young lad was keen to tell his mummy what Tommy and Jamie got, i.e. the ones that made him look good? You'll always find someone who appears to be much worse than you are, and therefore makes you look good and feels good and feel good. That's what the Pharisee has done. But what's the point in doing that? What is the point? If we are simply deceiving ourselves about ourselves. How much better to have a realistic view of ourselves by comparing ourselves against a true, objective, absolute standard of right and wrong. And that is the one which our Creator has provided for us. It's His standard that ultimately matters, not the people around you and not even your own. It's His standard that ultimately counts. He's given us a law which says, yes, the Pharisee knew these bits, a law which says that robbing and adultery and blasphemy are wrong. But it's a law that also says that pride and lust and anger and envy and jealousy are also wrong. He's given us a law that demands that we love the Lord our God with all our heart, our soul and mind, and we love our neighbour as ourselves. That is the benchmark which our Creator has set for us. That is the standard that we will one day be judged by. And therefore that is the standard that really matters. And if we compare ourselves against God's standard, then I suspect we would all end up with an opinion of ourselves which was much more realistic, an opinion of ourselves which was much more like the tax collector than that of the Pharisee. An opinion of ourselves which sees ourselves as sinners, people who have fallen drastically short of the standard which our Creator demands of us. And regardless of what other people may think of us, There is then and only then, once we've come to see ourselves as sinners, it is then and only then we've come to a correct and a true and a realistic estimation of ourselves. And more importantly still, it is then and only then that we've come to appreciate God's estimation of us. Which leads me to my third point this morning, and that is two men. We've seen two men who were very different in the estimation of others. We've seen two men who were very different in their estimation of themselves. Thirdly and finally, we see two men who were very different in the estimation of God. Now, the fascinating thing about this story is that whatever differences there were between these two men as they entered the temple that day, there was an even greater difference between them as they left the temple. Do you see that? I've said earlier that these two men, as they went to the temple, were poles apart. But do you realize that as they left the temple, the difference between them was even greater? And you think, I didn't think it could get any greater. Well, it did. And why do I say that? Well, in verse 14, we hear Jesus saying this, and please note, he's saying this concerning the tax collector. I tell you that this man, rather than the other one, went home justified before God. Did you hear that? What Jesus is saying is that it was the tax collector rather than the Pharisee who returned home that day in the right with God. As the tax collector walked home that day, he was no longer guilty in the sight of God, whereas the Pharisee walked home in the exact same condition as he has come to the temple, and that was as a guilty and condemned sinner. No change in him. He's gone home the same way as he came, a guilty and a condemned sinner. And so what we have at the close of the story is two men who are very different in the estimation of God. And the reason? Well, says Jesus in verse 14, everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. That is why I said earlier that our estimation of ourselves is very important. The Pharisee tried to exalt himself, not only in the estimation of others, but also in the estimation of God. He not only assumed that he was much better than everybody else, he also assumed that he was good enough for God. And it was to highlight the dangers of that assumption that this little story was told. Verse 9 tells us, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. As this man approaches God, his confidence is in his own righteousness. His confidence is in his own morality. His confidence is in his own religiosity. His confidence is in his own goodness and his own good deeds. And as far as he is concerned, that is all that he needs for his acceptance with God. Whereas the tax collector, on the other hand, humbles himself. He knows perfectly well that he's rotten through and through. He knows that if God is ever going to accept him, then it will need to be entirely on the basis of God's mercy. And that is why he prays, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. But what is even more interesting is that the word which is translated as mercy here in verse 13 is not the usual word for mercy. Instead, it is the Greek word hilasterion, which elsewhere is translated as propitiation. A word which means the removal or the quenching of divine wrath on the basis of sacrifice. And why on earth would he use that word? He's not the greatest theologian, we suspect. And so why does he use that word? Well, as this man was standing at the entrance to the temple, he would be able to see in the distance the temple altar. And on that altar would be the remains of a sacrifice which had been made for sins, a sacrifice which had acted as a substitute for sinners. And as this tax collector thinks about his sinfulness, he realizes that his only hope of ever being accepted by God is on the basis of sacrifice, on the basis of a substitute taking the wrath and the punishment that he deserves. And so he prays that God would be propitiated towards him. He prays that God's anger will be diverted, and that on the basis of sacrifice, God will accept him and forgive him. God, have mercy on me. What a contrast in their confidence as they approach God. Do you see the difference in their confidence? The one is trusting in his own righteousness. I give a tenth of all that I get. I go to church, I pray, I do all sorts of good things. The other is trusting in the mercy of God as demonstrated in a sacrifice for sins. And it is that contrast in the confidence of the two men that leads to the vast difference in God's estimation of them. Having confidence in his own righteousness, the Pharisee returns home a guilty, condemned sinner. Whereas having confidence in the mercy of God, the other man returns home a forgiven and a justified sinner. And so the question we need to ask ourselves this morning is this: where is our confidence? What are we relying on? What are we trusting in this morning? You see, the problem with having a high opinion of ourselves is not only that it's usually wildly unrealistic, it also leads to a misplaced confidence. And if we think that our moral and religious credentials make us much better than everyone else, then the chances are that we will be trusting in those moral and religious credentials for our acceptance with God. And if that is what we are trusting in this morning, then let us learn from the experience of the Pharisee in this story. If, like him, learn the lesson. If, like him, you are trusting this morning in your own goodness, your own outward morality, your own religious activity, if that is what you're trusting in this morning, then do you know what this little story tells us? It tells us that, like that Pharisee, you will return home from church a guilty and a condemned sinner. That is the solemn lesson of this story. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And therefore, if you and I are ever going to be accepted by God, then we'll need to come to God in the same way as the tax collector did. If you and I are ever going to know the forgiveness of God, then we'll need to tread the same path of humility that he trod. And on hearing that, you may be thinking to yourself, whoa, hang on a minute. You may be thinking to yourself, surely you're not suggesting that we put ourselves in the shoes of that immoral and unjust man. We are respectable people, respected in our families, respected in our community, respected in our church. And so surely you're not suggesting that we classify ourselves alongside that crook, are you? Yes, that is precisely what I am suggesting. And the reason I say that is because although you may not be the crook that he was, You are the sinner that he was. And until we see ourselves as a sinner who deserves nothing other than divine judgment, then we will never know God's forgiveness. We will never be justified by a holy God until we are trusting in God's mercy rather than our own merits. We will never experience God's salvation. That is the solemn lesson of this little story. The wonderful lesson of this little story. We've learned from the mistake of the Pharisee, I hope. But the wonderful lesson is that by trusting in God's mercy, a mercy which has been demonstrated supremely in sacrifice, and not now the sacrifice of a lamb in the temple, but the infinitely greater sacrifices that those lambs in the temple pointed forward to, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ upon the cross, that final and perfect and sufficient sacrifice for sin, that sacrifice where the judgment and wrath of God against sinners was dealt with once and for all by putting our confidence in the mercy of God as demonstrated in the death of Christ at the cross. You and I can know the pardon and the forgiveness and the acceptance with God that tax collector knew that day. Trusting in God's mercy alone. Not our merit, not our morality, not our religious observance. Trusting in God's mercy alone. We will return home this morning having been justified by God. As we've worked our way through this little story that Jesus told, we've seen two men. Two men who were very different in the estimation of others. Two men who were very different in their estimation of themselves, and because they were very different in the estimation of themselves, they ended up being very different in the estimation of God. The one went home a condemned sinner. The other went home forgiven and pardoned and justified. And so the question is, which of those two men are we going to be like this morning? I'm not asking which of the two you were like when you came to church. I'm asking which of the two men are you going to be like as you head home from church? Are you going to be like the Pharisee? Or are you going to be like the tax collector?